Well, right now, the United States is at war with the Islamic State. Now, we do not have boots on the ground, to use the president's terminology, but we do have thousands of American military advisors who are attempting to help in Iraq, the government, trying to help it be more diplomatic so that the Shiites will reach out to the Sunnis and to the Kurds. But in any event, we do have aircraft who have been supporting the Kurds in particular, to some extent the Iraqi government, in battles against the Islamic forces as they've come into Iraq. It's very inconclusive at this point, but it's going to go on for quite a while. And on the other side, in Syria, the training of forces has been delayed, but in due course will occur in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia or even Turkey. But we have been helping at least some of the Kurds on the Turkish border with air raids in Syria. So we're at war with ISIL. We have already suffered the decapitation situations with Americans, and likewise the potential for terrorism that would spread beyond that. Now, speaking of terrorism, I suppose the next biggest challenge is Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, other organizations that have already preyed upon Americans and created havoc. And certainly our intelligence services, cooperating with the intelligence services of others, are really essential in finding where these pockets of difficulty are. There are predictions regularly on television shows in America that there may be pockets of terrorism in the United States, supported by one or more of these international groups. Whether this is true or not, we are hopeful that our own intelligence forces are vigilant enough to smoke them out before they create havoc in America. So the entire terrorist business is there. Now, on top of that, we have still the nuclear problem that we're negotiating with Iran, and a nuclear problem in which the North Koreans do have nuclear weapons. And the question is, can they develop further shells that on a rocket or a missile of some sort could reach Hawaii or the United States, as they claim that they're active on? These are very real fears. For the time being, we are working with the Pakistanis and the Indians, hopeful that they at least have their nuclear weapons under control. But the problem of nuclear weapons is a challenge and will remain that way given all the disparate players in this. Well, right now, the nuclear relationship with Russia is not a good one. Unfortunately, after many, many years of Russians and the United States working together to gather up nuclear material or chemical material, other weapons of mass destruction in other countries, these efforts have broken down. They really must be restored. I think we understand for the time being that the Russians have decided they do not want to destroy any more of their nuclear weapons, and the United States Congress has indicated clearly we do not want to destroy any more of ours. So we're at a standstill in terms of the numbers under the New START treaty. But there was cooperation, at least with regard to scooping up others' problems. And I hope we can restore that partnership, because it's very, very important that we attempt to control these materials wherever they are on this earth. Ukraine has brought to the fore the fact that many of our NATO allies were not keeping up with their GNP for defense. We're not really in touch. That's changed. One of the things that's occurred in Europe, given the crisis in Ukraine, is much more of an interest in NATO. It could be more United States troops or bases will be in some NATO nations. Certainly some require this presently. I mention all of this because the United States is not at war in Ukraine, nor are European nations, but we are attempting at least to solidify the strength of Europe to support Ukraine so they get through their budgetary struggles, which are enormous. And likewise, to think through really how we are going to meet the problem of Ukraine as it tries to take back Donetsk and parts of the country that are now under control of so-called rebels, perhaps supported still by Russian troops. The Russian situation is one in which the sanctions against Russia have played a role in terms of the downgrading of the strength of the Russian economy, but the price of oil falling has probably been a much greater situation. Now, that sort of goes through Ukraine, it goes through Eastern Europe. In other words, the ramifications of the oil predicament really cannot be foretold, but they are very large.
It seems like it's slowed down Russia, if nothing else.
Without any doubt, the Russian economy and the Russian reserves have suffered very greatly, and probably will continue to do so if there's not going to be a change in the price of oil. And it doesn't look as if there will be. At the same time, the Russians were providing natural gas to Ukraine, but likewise to Eastern European countries, even to Germany. Now, the questions will remain: how reliable are those supplies? To what extent will they be utilized as foreign policy weapons?
I see that Europe will not relent.
Yes, the Europeans really have been solid. And I mentioned not the revival of NATO, perhaps that's the wrong term, but a renewal of greater interest. The fact is that many countries, seeing what has occurred in Ukraine, have decided that perhaps they were not as safe and quiet as they had thought, that the many decades without war in Europe, something unprecedented really in this decennial history, really cannot be foretold without being sure that the alliance is still there. Now, given that alliance, the desire to continue, even though there are sacrifices, and there have been in the case of many European countries with regard to their energy resources, quite apart from the problems they were already having with their economies and with deficits and what have you.
The cohesion of the European Union.
I think that you cannot characterize Europe in one fell swoop as going to the right or the left. It appears to me that each country is facing economic crisis with election campaigns that really cannot be foretold. We're going to see in the next few weeks a number of elections in which there are people who are attempting to suggest strategies given the crisis in their particular nations, but are neither particularly right or left. They're different. They are other than the government of those countries presently.
Devote a lot of attention to
I believe the pivot to Asia has led to consistent gains on the part of the United States in terms of its relationships with Asian nations. At the early point, it was not really clear what the pivot was all about, except we were going to pay more attention there. Now, clearly, it came to the fore in South Korea, where the United States solidly, with a lot of troops in South Korea, has offered great security to that country vis-a-vis North Korea, and/or arguments with Japan. Now, correspondingly, across the waterway with Japan has the Senkaku Island controversy with China. We've offered great support to Japan. And given the nuclear crisis there, this was very, very important to them. We are offering more support to the Philippines, who are very disturbed by Chinese ships that sometimes are around islands that they believe are clearly in their territory. And in the same way, we've offered a great deal more support to Vietnam and to other nations, and Indonesia and the Southeast China Sea, that feared that Chinese incursions into their territory were not only unacceptable, but they were not certain what to do about it. The United States participation in SEATO, the South Atlantic Treaty Organization, and in APEC, and other organizations there with regular attendance by high-level officials of the United States, have played quite a role in showing that our interest is not transient, that we are building blocks of interest. And so I'm encouraged by the pivot, as a matter of fact. I think that silently this has worked well. I remember going aboard the USS George Washington in Manila Harbor in 2012, noting the joy in the Philippines. That great ship was in the harbor. I've been cruising around the South China Sea and elsewhere for 6 months. This has been occurring frequently without great observation by citizens of the United States, but certainly observed by our friends in the Far East.
Well, we often...
I suspect that the Chinese-American relationship is the most important relationship in the Asian sector. I believe that our relationship still with Russia is a very important relationship on the European side. In both cases, we really need to work diplomatically to keep the avenues of discussion open and ways in which we cooperate. I think in the case of the Russians, for example, we had a strange chapter of cooperation after the president's red line in Syria that we would attack and so forth was removed, and Vladimir Putin came forward with the idea that we would work together to take care of the chemical weapons in Syria, which has occurred largely through American intervention on American ships with American technology, but nevertheless a degree of cooperation there with a third party that was significant. I mentioned earlier the need for work with the Russians continually to keep scooping up the leftovers from previous experiments in various other countries with weapons of mass destruction or materials that got away. These are important to both of our countries. Hopefully we can work with the Russians so that they withdraw from Ukraine and do not force showdowns there. But I think we have to recognize that President Putin frequently has utilized foreign crises to make up for difficulties domestically. And we may be in one of those periods in which he's utilizing Ukraine to try to fasten the eyes of Russians upon other enemies rather than the malfeasance of the control of their economy. I don't believe that we are in a different kind of order. It appears to me that there have been events that have jarred many countries, including our own, in the process. But it appears to me that the NATO alliance has been there all along, is more solid now, that the United States has a more solid relationship with organizations in Asia, as well as individual bilateral relationships, that essentially crises are occurring almost daily, unfortunately, in the economies of countries throughout Asia and in particular Europe. And these do change at least the outlooks of individual countries. But the Europeans remaining as solid as they have been politically together, given all of this, is really significant. So as a result, this has given us an opportunity to focus much more for the moment, for instance, on the Islamic State, on the problems of terrorism generally that could affect any country, not only the United States, but our European friends or our Asian friends or so forth. In other words, forces that are difficult to define, even defined through our intelligence services. Yes, I believe that the non-state actors, because they really are not a part of any nation, any well-defined organization that must at least show itself at the UN or in various other international fora. Even those countries with whom we have severe disagreements and strains, at least are a part of the world order through their organizational situations. We at least have some potential for diplomacy and for conversation. But if we do not really know who the players are, even where the leaders are of the terrorist groups, then this is a different order.
Bustable?
I believe that our strategy with regard to the Islamic State is still under study. It's evolving. The difficulty here is the Islamic State is very important in both Syria and Iraq. We have no relationship to speak of with the Assad government in Syria. We've often talked about other potential players in Syria, so-called moderate forces in quotes, although we've not been able to identify them or to see what their strength might be. So in Syria, you have the Islamic State occupying a good part of the country or dominating it, and the Assad government still hanging on. Even friendly governments like Turkey, feeling that Assad is the real enemy, first of all, rather than ISIL, with which we disagree. And right across the border in Iraq, a state in which we have spent a decade with American lives and American treasure, the government still is very weak. The new government is better than the one that it replaced, the Maliki government. But the Maliki government at least had almost destroyed the unity of Iraq, leading the discussion of three states, perhaps, Kurds and Sunnis and Shiites. Now, I think that discussion has been calmed down, but it's very difficult to face the Islamic State if you have three parts of a country that you've had really a great sacrifice to bring it to that point. I mention all of this because all around those countries, Iraq and Syria, are other countries that are affected by this. The huge outpouring of refugees from Syria in particular has certainly affected Jordan and Lebanon, and the problems of Iraq likewise, as people have tried to find a harbor somewhere else. And so the problem then is, what does the United States do about this? Now, the president said no boots on the ground. We're not going to send in huge armies to occupy the two countries, occupy Iraq again, really, and try to straighten out all of their situations. We've been down that trail not very successfully. We're going to, in fact, try to work with other countries. We're going to try to support them, bring about training, bring about finance that would be helpful to them. The elements within Iraq and Syria, hopefully, but likewise the neighbors around them who have a stake in this. But that's taking a lot of time, understandably. Physically, who is trained? Now, who do they fight? And under whose jurisdiction? In other words, how in the world is this particular war to be fought quite apart from brought to conclusion? And in the midst of all this, if there are terrorist groups that are hatching or are already there, that spread out somewhere else quite apart from Iraq and Syria while we're watching that, then we have, of course, further problems.
Okay, so that's
Yes, it really will require an extraordinary international cooperation. Now, in fairness, the United States has been attempting to bring this about. We are certainly working at it very hard. But it's not really clear how much of a role various governments want to play with us in that respect, what sort of responsibility they want to take. Some would say we have enough problems at home right now just with our budgets and our finance. One reason our defense budgets are way down is likewise we don't have the money, given the social services we've already promised, or the welfare educational regimes that we already have. So we have that problem in the United States to some extent. People would argue, how big should our defense budget be? To what extent do we have a responsibility to occupy these states, to govern the world, really to straighten out everybody's dilemma? And that will continually be a foreign policy argument in the United States.
Have you heard anybody that has for this?
No, I have not. I'm describing what I believe is sort of the conversation with our own government, both the executive and legislative, and certainly the press and various other persons who are offering opinions. But even if you had a strategy, getting other players to cooperate in that, others to help finance it, even our own structure in the United States to bring about the armed forces and the dedication over that period of time and the money that would be required. This is why we're centering upon other nations who are in the neighborhood helping, and Iraqis and Syrians working out some of their own problems in the process.
Well, some of that could help.
Yes, Iran will be an actor and hopefully a helpful one, but that remains to be seen for the moment, given the negotiations that we're having over the very serious issue of their developing a nuclear bomb. and the issue that that poses for Israel and Saudi Arabia and others in the area, quite apart from the problems that we have in Syria and Iraq.
Policy for the region.
Yes, I think simply leaving things to fester, to use your language, would bring about probably an Islamic state. We don't really know what that means precisely, but it does mean perhaps a totalitarian state based upon a form of the Islamic religion, and the possibilities, therefore, of a continual harboring of terrorists, of those who move out from the state to harm others, including the United States. So, in other words, to the extent that, going back to Afghanistan, we may not have been efficient in getting rid of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan before we were hit on 9/11. After we were hit, we knew that we had to go out there and find them and rid that problem. We're still working on that with Al-Qaeda, for that matter. Al-Qaeda, because it isn't just situated in one spot and may have colonies in all sorts of other places, is still in a position to create harm in our country.
Well, do you have a suggestion?
I believe that the intelligence services that we have developed are extremely important. This is not a first step. This is a step that's already occurring. It's a question of supporting this so that we have the very best ideas as to where everybody is in this business, where the terrorist cells may be, what their communications are with each other, what their plans may be. In other words, that to give us a clue so that we have an ability to defend ourselves before a catastrophe occurs in the United States, either a small one or a large one, as the case may be, or elsewhere in the world. In other words, the intelligence battle is going to be the big one. Now, this gets into another question of cybersecurity. What if, some would say, this becomes not a war on the ground in the typical sense, but rather nations try to cut off the communications of others, try to ruin their banking system for a while, or their healthcare systems, quite apart from intercepting their messages, knowing what is going on. And this is a battle of technicians that is proceeding that is extremely important.
Although I like that kind of warfare, you turn off the computer.